Hello, my name is Olu Ajilore. I'm a professor of psychiatry at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And today I'm going to be talking about our work looking at real-world assessment of mood and cognition for real-life impact. Here are my disclosures. The work that I'm going to be talking about today was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, as well as the National Institutes of Mental Health. And I'm going to be focusing on one of our current studies called Unobtrusive Monitoring of Affective Symptoms and Cognition using Keyboard Dynamics, or UNMASK. And what we're doing with UNMASK is that we're using neuroimaging to look at neural correlates of mood disorders and to see how they relate to how we interact with our smart connected devices like smartphones. And the inspiration for Unmask came from the development of an app by my colleague, Dr. Alex Leal, called BiOffect. And BiOffect replaces the default keyboard of your smartphone with a customized keyboard that allows us to track how you're typing, and importantly, not what you're typing, to infer information about your mood and cognition. And we look at several different typing measures, like how fast you're typing, the use of autocorrect, how frequently you're pressing the backspace, and all of this information gets inputted into algorithms that allow us to track levels of depression and cognitive function, as I'll describe in the next couple slides. We first tested this app in a collaboration with the University of Michigan and their Proctor longitudinal study of bipolar disorder. Patients used the app for a month, and during that month, they also did daily ecological momentary assessment ratings of mood, impulsivity, energy, and rapid thinking. And there were clinician-rated scales for the Hamilton Rating Scale of Depression and the Young Mania Scale that were done on a weekly basis. And from that study, we learned several things. One is that our keyboard metrics were significantly associated with clinician-rated scales of mania, as well as depression. And this was work done by one of our junior faculty members, Dr. John Zulueta. In addition, when we did a deeper dive into which of our metrics were specifically associated with mania versus depression, what John found was that less backspace usage was associated with more manic symptoms, and more typos were associated with more depressive symptoms. Building on this cross-sectional analysis, work by Jonathan Stange looked at whether instability in some of these typing metrics could be associated with worsening depressive symptoms in the future. And what he found was that instability of daily mood ratings, as well as instability of daily typing speed, predicted future depression levels. In addition, we were able to look at whether these typing metrics could be associated with measures of cognition, focusing on two particular tasks, the trail making test, part A and part B, which assesses processing speed and executive function, as well as the Tower of London task, which is another executive function task. And in work done by our graduate student, Mindy Ross, she found that typing speed was significantly associated with speed of performance on the trail making test across subjects. But more importantly, she also found that typing speed within the individual was associated with variations within the individual in trail making test performance. So the slower that you typed on a given day was associated with the slower your performance was on the trail making test. And in work done with Alex Demos and John Bark, pictured here, we also looked at the irregularity or entropy of move times on the Tower of London task, and participants with bipolar disorder had significantly higher entropy of their move times on this task compared to control subjects. And this was also reflected in the entropy or the irregularity of their typing speed, where patients with bipolar disorder had significantly higher typing entropy compared to controls. Furthermore, typing entropy in patients with bipolar disorder were significantly associated with entropy on the Tower of London task, as well as variability of depressive symptoms as measured by the Hamilton Rating Scale of Depression, and variability in impulsive actions and feelings. So this pilot study suggested that using this passive unobtrusive smartphone keyboard metadata, we could not only prospectively predict elevations in mood symptoms, but we could also probe cognitive function in bipolar disorder, like impaired processing speed and executive function. And this preliminary data formed the basis of our current study called Unmask, where we're looking to see whether keyboard dynamics could predict brain network correlates of cognitive dysfunction in participants across the spectrum of mood disorders. We're also looking to see whether these alterations in keyboard dynamics are associated with changes in clinical mood symptoms. And then we want to look at whether the relationship between what we're measuring on the smartphone and clinical mood symptoms are mediated by these changes in brain network properties. And so to do this, we have participants using the BioAffect app for a month. And during that month, they get 3 assessments using gold standard clinical rating scales as well as neuropsychological testing. And then they get 2 MRI scans. And the hypothesis is that our bioaffect-based typing metrics will be associated with brain network or connectomic correlates of cognitive dysfunction that are also associated with specific cognitive domains. So for example, on this first row, we look at how typing speed might be related to changes in structural brain network efficiency, which has been previously shown to be associated with psychomotor processing speed. And in an initial sample of participants from the Unmasked study, we do see that typing speed is indeed significantly correlated with global brain network efficiency as measured by structural brain network data derived from diffusion-weighted imaging. And here we're seeing that the better the efficiency, the better the typing speed. And the hope with this type of study is that we can use smart connected devices to passively, objectively detect changes in affective function and cognitive function and intervene even before it might be clinically apparent, and use this type of technology as an early warning detection system for mood disorders. But before we do that, we have to think about what are some of the keys that are necessary for successful translation from clinical practice and implementation. And so among those keys are scientific integrity. In the last couple of years, there have been an explosion of companies addressing digital mental health, raising billions of dollars in venture capital. But despite all of these companies, there's not a lot of evidence backing up some of the claims that these companies make. This is a quote from an article highlighting bioaffect in the Wall Street Journal, where an NIMH expert on mental health, Dr. Adam Haim, noted that the evidence-backed apps only make up 3% of the total number of apps that are available in the marketplace, and that sets up a lot of potential for false promise. NIMH is currently trying to address this with a recently announced funding opportunity where they tried to link academic and industry partners to improve scientific integrity and improve the evidence base backing up some of the claims made by these apps. Another key is ethical standards. You may be aware of the Facebook emotional manipulation study that was published several years ago, where they basically dialed up or dialed down the negative or positive content of one's feed on Facebook, and to see if that affected the affective content of what you posted. This was done in over 600,000 Facebook users. And they did show that you could affect the emotional content of what somebody posted by dialing up or dialing down the emotional content of what they were shown on their newsfeed. However, this study was done without proper informed consent, and it required a special comment by the journal PNAS. And they noted that there were questions raised about the principles of informed consent and the opportunity to opt out. And again, this brings up some of the ethical issues involved in digital mental health studies. Also, a couple years ago, there was some concern about release of NHS data to private companies like Google and Amazon that raised a lot of eyebrows. In addition, there was a paper published a couple years ago by John Toros and colleagues where they looked at the data sharing and privacy practices of various smartphone apps. They identified 36 apps that of which 29 actually transmitted their data to Google or Facebook, and only 12 of those apps actually disclose this in their privacy policy. Additionally, there have been efforts to address some of these ethical issues, like the Research Center for Optimal Digital Ethics, run out of UCSD and headed by Camille Nebeker. And they've published some work on some of the ways that we can address these ethical issues and actually give more control over to participants on how their data is used and how it's controlled. Another issue is stakeholder engagement. And this is a really important part of the digital mental health landscape. There are very high attrition rates for mental health apps in general. A lot of dropout rates have been shown to be nearly 50% for randomized controlled trials of smartphone apps. And so part of the ways to address this is to have stakeholders engaged in the design and implementation of these apps and of these studies. This has also been described by David Moore and colleagues in a recent viewpoint where they talked about an experimental therapeutics approach for digital mental health that involves measuring engagement of the participant in their use of the app. And so there's a need for improved diversity in the development of these apps and platforms. There's a need for community engagement in all phases, from conception to design to implementation and dissemination. And there's, of course, a need for clinician engagement as key stakeholders in the use and implementation of these apps. And this is a process that we have been engaged in for a current project called Lumen, where we're developing an AI-enabled conversational agent to deliver problem-solving therapy for patients with mild to moderate depression and anxiety. And this is just showing our iterative design process where we're using information from focus groups made up of key stakeholders in the design of our Lumen prototype, and we iterate on that design before we use it in our study. And so the keys for successful translation of some of these digital mental health apps into successful clinical practice and dissemination are scientific integrity, maintaining good ethical standards, and making sure that we have engagement of all the relevant stakeholders involved. And with that, I'd like to end and acknowledge my colleagues. If you'd like to learn more, you can check out our website at brain.uic.edu. And thank you for this opportunity to present at this incredible conference.